I'm Mary Davidson, and it's our community. Our guest today is Larry Thomas. And Larry is a professor of art here at Johnson County Community College and chair of the art department. And a very interesting part of him at the moment is that he has a show at the Epstein Gallery at Village Shalom. Your art is just kind of fascinating. I just love it. I have to ask you, has your art always looked like this, or have you changed from representational art in your early days? How has your talent evolved?
I suppose if you start with school as the beginnings, I think probably I really thought a lot about art by the time I was around 7, and kind of knew that that's probably the direction I would go, even though I did lots of other things. When I was in undergraduate school, I worked very representational. I think a lot of people do, just to kind of learn your chops and that sort of thing. I probably didn't start working really abstractly until after I got out of graduate school, which would have been around 1982. I went to graduate school off and on for a long time, from the mid-70s till 82. And it's evolved over time. Probably the work now has evolved slowly since about 1993, and the body of work that I'm currently doing has really probably been most specifically over about the last 5 or 6 years.
And to me, it's just sort of one of the mysteries of life. When you decide that your style is going to change, I mean, your style has changed drastically then, from beginning to now.
Yeah, and it's kind of gone through different periods.
Well, what causes you to do that?
What
do you think about when you? I mean, do you wake up one morning? It's just like me. I wake up one morning and I say, "And now today I'm going to go on a diet," or do you wake up one morning and you say, "Well, today I'm going to change my style"? How do you do that?
I think art normally is reflective of your own life. It should be reflective of the time. It's always a mirror of its time period, and then you have to be you. So it's normally something that happens to you, or you observe it, or I read a lot, and so things begin to evolve. I was fortunate enough to have an uncle that lived in New York for about 30 years, and so I spent a lot of time going there. And my uncle was very much into the arts. He was a very good pianist, and he was very interested in visual art. So I started going to the Village back in the 60s during the beatnik era, and then into the and so we went to the Village, and we went to the Guggenheim when it was only about 7 or 8 years old, and went to MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, and the Met. And so I was very interested in that. My uncle fortunately knew I was very interested in that, and so I would say that I was a pretty literal thinker, like most kids and students are, until I was into...
Would you define literal as one-dimensional, sort of?
Well, when you start talking about art, one-dimensional is a point, and even it has dimension. I would say that I wasn't very poetic, or I didn't think much in metaphors. It just isn't.
You were young.
Yeah, it was. My work was kind of predictable, and kind of went through the phases that I think any young person who goes into art does, except very exceptional people, and I was certainly not exceptional. I would say I was probably very good at technically, because I had been drawing. I used to watch the old John Nagy show on TV and draw those pictures that John Nagy, and he had a little box and all that. And so I could draw pretty representationally, pretty well early on. And in school and that sort of thing, I was kind of known for that. But
were you a cartoonist?
I started out that way. We had taken a trip to St. Louis, and on the way back, and when I got there, we bought a comics book, and of course when you're 7, you like comics. And so I was drawing these things, and I would take them to my mother, and she'd go, "That's fine." But she didn't realize I was drawing them. She thought I was tracing them. And then when she found out I was drawing them and they were that accurate, and my uncle saw those, I got attention.
He said, "Oh my goodness, the kid has talent."
Yeah, that's kind of the way it was. So, anytime you get an attention as a kid, you're going to go with that. So I would say up and through, I worked pretty representationally, pretty predictable at first, and then as you realize that art really isn't about the technical aspects, or it was, for me it shouldn't be, or wasn't. It was more about, maybe philosophy or psychology, or what was happening to you, how you interpret things, how you express things. At first, when I was a kid, I just didn't think abstract art was good. You know, I just didn't like it at all. I thought it was silly and, you know, pretentious and everything else. But then as you begin to study the theory, you begin to study what it's about, why it is, what it comes about, it begins to change you. And even after that, I still was fairly representational. And then when I got out of school, I felt like I needed to kind of rebel against everything that I had done. So I began to work fairly abstractly.
Do you believe that perhaps as you mature, that you're more willing to let your soul show?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think it varies from person to person, but certainly I think that's sort of the process, yeah. I think if you're going to be an artist, you have to take risks, and you can't sort of play it safe. And so some of that rebellion and some of those things that I was getting kudos for, I thought that may be too safe, or that may be I've got to do something different. I needed to rebel against that.
I'm going to say something that you said. You said, at first glance, my prints and paintings appear quite abstract, but closer inspection reveals complex layers of realistic images that seem to camouflage, I repeat that because it's a very key word here, other hidden objects or figures. And you have a painting called Erroneous Wind that might be a good example of something that you have done. Could we talk about Erroneous Wind as a camouflage? Because camouflage is a really big part of your thinking at the moment.
Yeah, I would say that over the last, particularly the past 10, but almost 16 years, this idea has been prevalent in what I've been doing. And I almost have to tell you the genesis of this to make sense of it. In 1993, which was about 16 and a half years ago, I had a kidney transplant. And when you have a kidney transplant, as a lot of people know, you have to take immunosuppressants. They take your immune system and shut it down, and then they wean you off of that. And I'm always a little hesitant to talk about that because people will, you know, it's always just evoking sympathy, or there's always that potential to take that wrong. And in fact, I feel very fortunate and very lucky because I used to teach art history. And so I think in terms of like 30,000 years.
But what you've also said is that camouflage as an immune system, or even as an assault tactic, is of particular interest to me. Plants, animals, sea life, insects, and humans all use this cunning tool of optical deception. Right.
And so in my mind, the immune system, the medicines that I take really don't work this way. But because I'm an artist, I get to use my imagination, and people don't hold me to reality. I see the kind of the pills as almost an immune system, like that's protecting the kidney, but also, in fact, the pills are attacking the T cells that are attacking, or who want to attack that foreign body.
Okay, well, let's take Erroneous Wind again, and talk about the picture that you have, or the product, the piece of art that you have created as an attack, a camouflage, why you named it that. I mean, it doesn't look like the representational, well, it's not representational wind.
No.
It's camouflage.
And it's all about metaphor. And if you've ever seen Merce Cunningham, or if you know about Merce Cunningham, he does dances but without the music. And so oftentimes my titles are created, and the images are created, and then the titles go with them after the fact, because underneath all the work is essentially the same in terms of where it's going, but something in each image will suggest the title that I've already probably made up, and then I match them. So in that particular one, I'm actually in there a couple of times myself as the model. And then there are other objects that are in there. And I've always been very interested in this relationship between abstract and representationalism because I've done both. And so what these images are kind of a synthesis of that. And so it's a matter of, when you first look at them, they're one thing, but as you look closer, you'll see all kinds of other things.
Well, and you further say that this is primarily a device to make things invisible, while art is normally involved in making the invisible into something visible.
Right.
So you have reversed the thinking there.
Well, I like irony, and I think the irony of a visual immune system like camouflage, blending or assimilating or imitating or pretending or deceiving, those are all very, very interesting concepts, not only on a visual level, but even on the way we act. Oftentimes we're camouflaging our qualities to appear as if we belong to a group, for instance. So we're trying to assimilate, so we'll imitate a group maybe to belong or feel accepted. There's all kinds of things, both visual and kind of metaphorically and poetically.
But as you talk about, there's another one that I really kind of like. You call it Mummer's Lure. And talk about Mummer's Lure. It looks to me like a hook. And talk about it in relation to camouflage, in relation to making the visible invisible. How did you?
Well, mummers, they're kind of a mysterious group. They go back, I think, into the 15th century.
Yes, they do.
And they're kind of a mysterious group. They usually were small parties that would go into private homes, or they were just performers, often in costume. Sometimes at Christmas they would come in and just do Christmas. But also the snake oil salesmen kind of come through that same tradition. And of course they were disguising or camouflaging who they were, which were basically con men. And so the name was kind of interesting to me. The shape of it is also, somebody noticed that it's kind of like a question mark. Mm-hmm. And so, but it could be a hook or it could be all kinds of things. I like to talk about these things up to a point without revealing too much, because I think some of the magic is lost.
It is.
Or it will take what you might interpret it to be, which might be more interesting than what I even thought it was going to be.
And you don't care?
Oh, I love that. I love for somebody else to bring their own story. And I think what abstract art does is allow the viewer the openness to get involved and make their own interpretation, and I rather like that. I have my reasons for doing things, but when somebody comes up and owns it themselves, that's really a gratifying kind of
They bought
quality.
Stock in the company.
Yeah, yeah. And they got to own a little bit of it
did.
and make up
They
their
did.
own meaning.
Well, and mummers are not what they seem either.
Right. Oh, exactly.
So,
yeah, they're pretending they're doing something that is not normally them. Yeah, I love that stuff.
I think that's, and you're also a printer.
Actually, both my master's degrees are in printmaking. When computers came along, I became extremely involved in that. So these are actually prints. All these works are actually worked up on the computer first, and then
Really?
like with the first two are actually printed from a rather large inkjet printer, and then I go back in and paint into them. The paintings are also on printed material, and then they're adhered to the canvas, and then I paint back into them. I always paint on them because, well, one, I don't like the flatness of the straight print. They look too much like posters. And I like the texture. I was primarily an intaglio printmaker, and the ink really comes off the paper, and you're very aware of the texture. Plus, the fact that when you look at the work, you'll see maybe globs of paint, and then there'll be a little bit photographic, and then there'll be a little bit computer. And so it's actually testing your visual perception. What am I looking at? What is that? And when we look at anything, we more or less do that. We're saying, is that safe? We're kind of fight or flight. And so is this okay or is this not? We're at some unconscious level, we're always at that fight or flight level, and that's where the deception becomes interesting, because you're always saying, is this good for me or is this bad for me? And you're going to react one way that I'm either comfortable with it or I'm uncomfortable with it, and our instincts are very, very important.
Well, I think some people are uncomfortable with non-representational art just in general.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's something that, Pollock said that we can't live in the same age like, say, Rembrandt and use those tools. We have to devise new tools, new techniques for, at that time, an age of radio and the rocket ship or the airplane. Yeah. I feel the same way. I adopt, as much as I can, the latest cutting computer things, and then combine that with more old world painting things to combine the two. I like duplicity, and I like things layered, and I like things that are opposites and irony, and I kind of throw all that stuff in the soup and see what happens.
Okay, well, as we look at another one, it's called Poser's Decoy. And the title doesn't really say much of anything. So I want to use this one to say to you, as you created Poser's Decoy, what were you thinking? What went through your mind? Why did you put a sort of a wine-colored piece up there? Why did you use yellow? I mean, to me, it looks almost, I'm afraid I'm taking the Rorschach ink blot test here, but it looks kind of like maybe a person or an animal even, it could be. What went through your mind when you did Poser's Decoy?
I've always got all these things in the back of my head, but when I work, I work very intuitively. I keep files and files and files and files of images. A lot of times I scan them on the scanner or I take pictures of them. I go to auctions a lot and I buy stuff that looks like it's just interesting or I can make it into something. And as I work, you know, I remember as a student I used to ask my professors, what are you thinking about when you work? Because, you know, I'm thinking about how do I dip this brush in here and how much do I... And sooner or later, when you work a lot and over a period of time, you kind of know what's going to happen. So I don't think about those things. It's really intuitive. What seems to work? What seems to be interesting? And what have I not done before? And so it's a very intuitive process at that. But I just let my unconscious that I'm interested in, like all these things, camouflage, disguise, I let those sort of sit in the back, and then I don't know that I rationalize them.
Well, so your basic philosophy is there, but then at some point the intuition takes over.
Right. And then I just have more or less fun with it, but it's for serious intent. But at the same time, I think that if I were going to be something else that I had to be serious about, I'd much rather be an artist because you get a kind of a sense of play with that.
Do you like color?
I love color, and the color comes. And I used to not be that way. I didn't work in color until after I was out of graduate school. I worked almost specifically in black and white. But after the transplant, I didn't know anything about internal organic. I knew what my freshman health teacher taught me about internal anatomy, and he was the head football coach, and so you probably didn't learn a lot. So I started studying internal anatomy. I teach life drawing, so I knew gross anatomy, but I didn't really know that much about the organs and how things work. And I ran across Leonard Nielsen's photographs, and he was the photographer back in the 50s who had the first embryo on Life magazine. Take those cameras and go deep into the body. And these things are rich in beautiful colors. And also, speaking back to New York again, I've always loved Times Square and watched it evolve over 30 years. It used to be just the two screens on each side of the square, and now it's just lights and color and bombardment. And at one level, at one layer of the work, I think about, okay, there's physical immune systems, but I wonder if we have psychological immune systems to take in all the things that we see on the computer, the TV, the ads. And if you've seen images of Times Square lately, it's just exploding. It's a bombardment. Yeah. So I look to that to some degree and see those colors and the seductiveness of it. And color is so important in camouflage anyway.
And particularly in today's world, color and noise and movement.
And there was a big shift in color when Warhol started painting. Before that, you look at the painters, and the colors at that time seemed bright to them, but when Warhol took on the pop culture, and those colors brightened up and got intense and seductive, that's when almost everybody's palette changed.
The colors, the palettes in your works are sometimes very different. What decides you on what colors to use in that particular this one, for example, this is Faithful Mask. It's kind of gray, blue. It's not as bright as some of the others that
It's not as intense, that's for sure.
So were you feeling different that day? What caused you to do that? What is it that triggers the color selection?
Because I work layer at a time, and I work so intuitively, I just kind of let that, or there may be something that I saw or that I experienced, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's a color I haven't really used, and I think I want to investigate that, and then begin to play with those color combinations. I think a lot of artists have their own color palette, And I'm a little bit more restless than I think most artists are with that. I could see that to be open to criticism from an art critic, but I just, my palette changes, and I think it's just because of a restlessness of a, I want to see what's going to happen.
Well, and you've done Enchanting Shroud. I love that. Enchanting Shroud has orange, beautiful, bright orange, and I like those too because they're really in contrast. This one, it pops out at you. Why Enchanting Shroud? I didn't think shrouds were enchanting. I guess that's
Yeah, I like irony.
Yeah.
And the idea of you know, a seductiveness or somebody is shrouded isn't.
Well, it looks almost like
typically.
somebody is wrapped in that bright orange
and that's
cape.
probably what triggered the idea of the shroud. But the colors were kind of enchanting colors.
Well, yeah, because there's a pink and an orange right there together.
And again, color in the animal world in particular is extremely interesting. And certainly in the plant world, there's not a lot of camouflage in the plant world, and they're just starting to kind of look at that. But certainly a flower is trying to use colors to seduce, to get the bees to come to it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, those kind of things flit through my mind as I'm working, and so I'll go, oh, well, that's kind of a cool idea.
So
Let's
you're
go
just
with
a
that.
busy little thinker when you work.
Maybe a bit.
I want to change the subject just a little bit to what you do as well, and that is teach. Often, students paint just like their teacher. Many of the students of Thomas Hart Benton paint kind of like he did, and there are others too. That do you notice that?
I go out of my way to avoid that because I had a teacher like that when I was a sophomore in college, and I didn't do like everybody else did. I didn't paint like him, and I didn't particularly. I thought he was a good instructor. Only C I ever made in an art class because
You couldn't paint like he painted.
Yeah, I wasn't one of the loyalists, and you know, interestingly enough, years later, some of the things that he told me, I remember being at the easel and going, oh, I see what he was getting at. But at the time, I was kind of rebelling against that, being the student that painted like the teacher. And so as a matter of fact, I don't show my work to my classes.
Really?
Unless they ask, and only till later in the semester, because some of them already know the work. But I would rather them not be, and really I push them to be themselves. And I don't really teach a lot of technique. I get them going, but I say it's much more interesting if you devise your own techniques, your own vision, rather than the canned things that have already been done.
You've been teaching quite a while.
More do I care to admit.
What kind of change, if any, do you see in the art production that your students put out? Is it angry? Is it soft? Is it representational? Is it contemporary? What do you see? Has there been a lot of change over these years, and what is of interest to them artistically?
Well, to some degree, some of that is my own involvement, and I think this is typical with a lot of teachers. Your first 4 or 5 years, you teach like those who taught you, and then you begin to get restless with that, and you start really teaching the way you learn or how you've developed. I think the biggest difference is probably over the last 10 to 15 years. Most all students are doing work. I mean, we live in a mediated world. Everything comes through a screen. Yeah. We've got iPods and computers and you know, the new iPad that came out. So most of their stimulus is not firsthand. It's almost always secondhand. It's coming through somebody else's filter. And so to get people to not just duplicate that is much more of a challenge than it used to be, because there was just a different thinking about that.
Well, you don't want them to draw pictures out of comic books anymore.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's right.
But I think when we talk to each other, that's probably the thing that comes up the most, is how do we get people to find and get in touch with their own feelings and not be so influenced by the media or what's mediated in so many different ways.
Don't you think when you're young that's hard to do?
It's extraordinarily difficult because we had a speaker a few years at our all-staff meeting, and she talked about the fact that she babysitted her niece, and the niece had the iPod, and she had her computer, and you know, 2 or 3 other things. And she said, how do you deal with all this technology? And the little girl looked up at her and said, what technology? She didn't see that as technology. That was just normal living. Whereas we who've seen the change, we see that as technology. And I think as a teacher, I will do things that maybe somebody my age in business might not do, because I will watch TV programs, I will see what they're looking at, I will try to stay in touch as much as possible, because once you're out of touch, and particularly at my age, you're just not worth listening to.
I'm glad you didn't say our age.
You have to, maybe I shouldn't be giving the secrets away, but
you know what? You're talking about technology, and we live in a world of technology. But I have this notion that technology to some degree stifles conversation and interaction and often personal growth. Because talking to people and interacting with others, I think, and maybe I'm just getting old too, but I just think that that's really important.
You know, it's an interesting dilemma, because on the one hand, I never walk out of a classroom into the hallway that almost every student isn't on the phone or texting. So they're communicating.
Yeah, but they spell thanks, THX.
Yeah, but we don't speak like Chaucer anymore either.
No.
So there is a progression in language and the way we communicate, and I have to keep that in mind.
That Aprila has changed.
Right, right. Well, I mean, you know, if you talk to somebody, you know, 200 years ago that was speaking English, it's not like you and I are talking. It's really different. So you almost have to anticipate there's a change, and I have to continue to remind myself to stay open to that kind of transition. What I find more difficult is that there is, I think there's maybe more communicating.
Do you? But of a different sort.
But like you and I are speaking, and we're using hand gestures and smiling, in that email, that can be so misrepresented, or the text can be so misrepresented so easily, and it's happened to me, and it's probably happened to you, where I meant one thing, and they knew my sense of humor or whatever, or maybe they did and they still didn't get it, they saw it as angry.
That's right. Somebody told me a long time ago, don't capitalize the whole word because people think you're screaming at them.
You're yelling at them. So you have to learn the new language, and that can be quite subtle. And I think the thing that concerns me is the interaction, the individual interaction, and the body language, or just somebody's eyes, you know, doing one thing but their mouth is doing something else or whatever.
But see, often I think artists interpret the world. And it's very interesting because as the world around, I'll say I, have lived long enough to see that world change a lot around me. And as that world changes, the interpretation changes, and often, and you're so right, you have to stay in touch.
Right.
Because when you get out of touch, you lose the ability to interpret. We're all in a state of camouflage.
Well, you know, that I see in those terms all the time, so I definitely am very sensitive to that. And one more layer of that, and is that this point that I made, my son came home a few years ago and was in a math class and said, my professor said there's more people living on Earth right now than the whole combined population of the Earth before 1950. And when I was born in 1950, it was 2.5 billion people on the planet, and there's closer to 6.5 billion now. We've almost tripled in size in our lifetime. That's a mind-boggling thing that affects all of us in this bombardment of how do we deal with that.
Well, I have to say that this has been such an interesting conversation. We have talked about concealing, revealing, hiding, camouflaging thoughts and ideas and emotions. And I think that Larry Thomas, artist, chair of the art department at JCCC, and he has a show. And now we know why he calls it Ploys and Decoys. And it's at the Epstein Gallery. Go see it. And you might see Larry on campus out here. You can say hi to him. It's our community, and I'm Mary Davidson. It's been awfully nice talking to you.